Well, here we are at Theo Fantastique. We don't really have a podcast. We have occasional video conversations. And I'm privileged today to have a friend, colleague, and collaborator, frequent collaborator, Brandon Grafius. Brandon, welcome. Have
Thank
you
you.
you've been on before, haven't you?
I have been. Yeah, I've been
Yeah.
on just you and I have talked before, and then we had a conversation about Doug's book
Yeah,
and
right,
some
right,
different
right.
things like that. So,
Yeah, I
so yeah,
couldn't
we've been
remember if
on
you had
before, and I'm
one
so
on.
glad to be on again, John. Thanks for
Yeah,
the
it's
invitation to come back.
great to have you here. Let me, for folks who don't know, they can look in the program description for this information, but we'll get it on record here from the back of the book we're going to be talking about. Brandon is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit, where he teaches Old Testament and Hebrew, a film reviewer and columnist, as well as a religious scholar. He is a frequent podcast guest, often speaking about films, horror, and religion. His books include Reading the Bible with Horror, boy, I'm going to mess this one up, Grauenmeyer Award,
Graumeyer. Yeah.
Award nominee, and a handbook on the film The Witch. So it's all good. And today we're going to be talking about, I'll put it up here, this fantastic book.
Oh,
It's got this cool reflective kind of cover there. We'll get the special effect in there.
Yeah, isn't that neat? I saw a PDF of the cover, the graphics of the cover to approve it, but I was completely caught off guard when I opened the box and saw that it had this neat texture and reflective things.
Yeah,
on
it's
wave
really
effects.
cool. I like
really
it there.
neat.
And the title, a complete title, Lurking Under the Surface, Horror, Religion, and the Questions That Haunt Us. And that's certainly up my alley, and obviously up your alley as well. Before we get into some of the book, I always like to find out, what is it personally that got you into? There aren't a whole lot, as you know, there aren't a whole lot of people who bring religious conviction, at least not Christian conviction, and a love for horror together. So what was it that brought those two things? What was your experience? Was it a horror film? What was it?
Well, I do think that there are more and more people who are finding ways to bring those two together. And I feel like with this book, I've got people just coming out of the woodworks that I suddenly learned that one of the editors at the Christian Century is a huge horror fan. And the people at Sojourners magazine love horror and are looking for ways to bring more of it in. So I do think there's more awareness that these are really interesting conversation partners. But when I was first doing my PhD program, I started 12 years ago now. At that time, there wasn't a lot of this conversation. There were a couple of books. I've always loved horror, and I've felt drawn to, I felt drawn to studying texts. As an undergraduate major, I was English literature, did a master's in English as well. And so the transition from there to being a biblical scholar was kind of natural, that you're still studying texts and reading things closely. But I kept those two things really separate. I was a pretty serious horror fan, but also a biblical scholar in the other corner of the ring. I've always loved movies just more broadly, but horror has been where I focused a lot. So it was really an accident reading a footnote in my PhD program. Was working through a book called Apocalypse Against Empire, and there was this brief note about monster theory, which was the first time I had heard this was a thing or had considered that you could study this stuff seriously. And that led me to, at that time, just a handful of books and articles in the field of biblical scholars that were on monsters, and started getting me to think about how I could expand the conversation from this narrow focus on monsters to a more broad-based lens of horror, and really looking at not only the character of the monsters, but narrative structures, look at thematic elements and all of those things that go into the study of horror.
It's fascinating how we don't see what we aren't prepared to see. I get a lot from conservative Christians, how can you do this horror thing? It's dark and evil and monstrous. And one of my parts of my response is, well, have you read the Bible? Right? And you're an Old Testament and Hebrew professor. Was it just until you had seen that scholarship, you never connected dots from biblical monsters to this horror?
I really didn't, or at least didn't think about how you could use the same kind of analytical tools to help facilitate this conversation. I do think I was drawn to study the Hebrew Bible as opposed to New Testament or theology or other field like that, largely because I think the Hebrew Bible does have these just wonderful dark corners of places that you can explore where you're not necessarily in a safe space. And I think the best texts give you that feeling, whether it's a religious text or a text of horror, that you're not necessarily safe, that you might be challenged, that you might be made uncomfortable. Hopefully it's uncomfortable in a positive, productive way, as opposed to just a nasty, negative uncomfortableness. But I still think that that feeling of a little bit of danger is really crucial for moving forward, for learning something.
Yeah. Well, so it sounds, if I'm understanding your experience and your journey correctly, for me, in a more conservative Christian expression in the past, it was almost, I was being told that they're almost like, when you try and put two magnets together, they repel each other. Your religious interests and your interest in horror, they don't come together. They shouldn't come together. And it took a reassessment to see great commonality and appropriateness. For you, it was like they were just kind of like two separate tracks that finally.
Yeah, I grew up in a fairly progressive Christian tradition. I grew up United Church of Christ, and I remember being at high school overnights where we'd watch fairly mild but still watch horror movies just at the church overnight. And so it wasn't like this was something that was bad or something that you were supposed to stay away from, but it also took a long time for me to recognize that maybe they have more overlap than I've assumed.
Yeah. So what was I always also like to hear about how the ideas for books come to people. Sometimes it's the craziest ways. What was the genesis, here use that term for a Hebrew Bible scholar, what was the genesis of this book for you?
Well, a couple of things. I published a few academic books. Then I published the handbook on the witch that's kind of designed as a reference guide for people studying that movie. I hear it's used in American studies classes and things like that as well, which I've been very pleased to hear. But I started thinking about, okay, what kind of a book do I want to write next? I certainly I want to get my scholarship out to a broader audience. I think the work is interesting enough that I want people to know about it, and I want to have this conversation with people. So I started thinking about, so how can I package that? How can I take this work in a way that's going to make people really want to read it? And I started thinking back to my book, Reading the Bible with Horror, which in many ways is a pretty dense academic book. It uses Hebrew. It's got almost as many footnotes as probably more footnotes than it has pages. But the introduction was kind of a personal story. I remember the first line of the book is, when I was 12, I wasn't afraid of dying, as kind of a way to get into my experience watching The Omen and what really did scare me as a 12-year-old. And I was thinking about how that 8 to 10 page introduction was maybe the most fun part of that book for me, and a part that I keep coming back to and thinking about. So what would it be if I wrote a whole book that was in that mode, where I don't completely turn off the lens of the scholar that I use, but I also, I get to mix my metaphor, crank up the volume on the storyteller, and talk about my personal experience with horror movies, how that does or does not connect with my faith journey, and the work I've tried to do to put these two areas in conversation with each other. That sounded to me like a really fun book to write. And I just started writing with the hope and the trust that other people would get what I was trying to do, and that there would be people interested in that.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really appreciate about this volume. I love the academic stuff that you and others do. I like the popular stuff, but it seems like there's more need to take what we learn in scholarship and to make that accessible to a general reader. Did you get a sense that was part of what you wanted to help readers with?
Absolutely. Both for the dense scholarly nature of my previous work, and honestly for the price points. They're not books that you'd expect people to just pick up off the shelf and read unless they're really doing serious research. Those first two books, most of the sales have been to libraries, and every now and then I see a reference to them in scholarly work, and I'm happy that people are able to use them that way. But it's not the kind of book that really gets people reading. So
Right.
that's something I want to accomplish, want to do.
Yeah. As I was looking at the book, one of the questions I had was who the intended audience was. On the one hand, obviously, it's for people who already see the value in this, and you're kind of helping them on that journey. Do you also hope that maybe people who might be mildly curious about the possibility that they would pick it up? What kind of audience makeup do you see?
Absolutely. So I think you've hit on this a lot of the discussions I had with my agent and discussions we've had with the publisher, that we've got that core audience of people who get the connection between religion and horror, or who are interested in both of them and are excited to have a way to bridge them together. That's also not a huge core audience.
Right.
So I really do hope, and so far my experience has borne this out, that it can also be interesting to people who are interested in not only Christianity, but issues of spirituality and meaning making in life in general, can see this as a way to do this. I've had some conversations with people who've said, I have no interest in watching any of the movies that you talk about in that book, but I really enjoyed that conversation and feel like it was really helpful and productive. And then on the other hand, I also hope that it can speak to people who are fans of horror and maybe don't have much time for church, or think of themselves as people who aren't interested in those questions of spirituality, that it can still say, well, okay, this is a really interesting and helpful thing that these movies can do, and a way for me to take these movies I love and look at them either a little more deeply or just from a different angle.
To dive a little bit deeper into that question of the spirituality aspect, one of the interesting facets of your book, the way you've got it laid out, is you include pre-chapter reading recommendations on there, right?
Yeah.
And obviously that can be, you intend that to be used as kind of a helpful study or reflection as people go through the material. But here's a heretical question. Could it also function for some as a kind of spiritual devotion?
That I like that idea. So the pre-chapter viewing recommendations, right?
Right.
Of
Yeah,
movies to suggest. And I really do like that idea of a devotion, that you read one chapter a week and watch the, usually just 2 or 3 movies at the beginning of each chapter that you'd watch while you're walking along with this book. I hope that would be something that would be helpful not only for individuals, but I can really imagine a study group, choosing one of these movies to watch and one of these chapters to read to accompany it. I think that could be really fun. But I love the idea of
move
seeing that as
over,
devotional.
Zondervan. Yeah, get out of the way, life way. It's time for something
Exactly.
radical,
Yeah,
different and devotional. Yeah, I thought it was.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
How do you see, and how do you touch on this in your book, horror and religion addressing haunting, serious questions of life, but both doing it, and then by bringing them together, you get something even more important and significant.
Yeah. I think for a long time we thought of questions of meaning, questions like, who am I? What is my role in this society, in this world? What is our place as people in the cosmos? And what governs all of this? We thought those questions were kind of reserved to the realm of religion, because that's maybe the place where they're discussed most obviously. But I really like our friend Doug Cowan has reframed those as properly human questions, which I think is absolutely right. Victoria Nelson had a book a couple decades ago called The Secret Life of Puppets, where she argues that as the role of religion in life has declined, popular culture comes in to fill this void, because we all have these questions that we want to explore and wrestle with. I think that's generally right, but the one way I'd push back on that thesis is that I think pop culture has always been doing that. Even when popular culture was stories around the campfire or ballads and sagas and things like that, that we've always tried to explore these questions in narrative form through what you might call, what we would now call speculative fiction, but what used to be myths and fairy tales and all of those stories, whether those are within a religious framework or not, they're trying to get at the same kinds of questions that religion is asking, and sometimes provides answers and sometimes just wants to ask the questions.
Now, chapter 4 in your book, for me, was the most significant. Everybody reads things are going to connect with them more than others. Entitled Faith Against the Darkness.
Oh, yeah.
And we live in a time today where we've got this national and international polarization and conflict and all this. How do you see horror and religion providing a perspective on this, and lessons whereby people of faith or no faith, whatever it may be, can look at these resources and then tap into it for real answers or guidance on important existential questions and challenges?
For me, one of the biggest problems in our society and in our political discourse is that we don't take things seriously enough. On one hand, we take things very seriously, that they're matters of life and death, and we're willing to fight or kill over them. But what we're willing to fight or kill over are often, when you boil down to it, they're less important. We're more concerned about standing up for our tribe and owning the opposite team than we are any of the real questions or figuring out how we can make the world a better place for people. So I think we need to take those questions more seriously than we take the day-to-day horse races of politics is one way to look at it. And then the other way is just thinking about it as I think often we've gotten to a place where politics is like sports. And we just have rumbles with people from the other team. Horror and religion are all about taking things seriously. I think you can see that clearly in religion, but one of the things I try to lay out in that book, Faith Against the Darkness, is that so often horror encourages us to take the evil in the world, the things that we're struggling with, take them seriously. One of the examples I have is that the movie I really love, The Last Exorcism, with the evangelical priest who's clearly a charlatan and has spent his career doing fake exorcisms, and his view is that, well, they believe it's real, so I'm providing a service. But he's clearly a huckster, and he runs into a real case of demonic possession, and he's completely unprepared to handle it because he has not taken evil seriously through his whole life. Seems like he hasn't taken much of anything seriously. So I think horror frequently functions that way, whether it is calling us to take the realities of evil seriously, whether it's calling us to take the past seriously, whether it's calling us to take mental illness seriously. My favorite horror is the horror that pushes us to look at those realities of the world and take them seriously.
My hope is that a book like yours can also help us see the horror many times in our own religious traditions, maybe even within the way we live our faith, the way reflected in many of our sacred texts. It's not just out there. I think we also need to look in here.
Yeah.
And I think your book is very helpful in that regard. Now,
the original title, you might be curious to know, was called Monster. My original title was Monster in the Pews, where I was really trying to play on that duality of the horror being outside the church, and we try to build walls around it. That's why we have a wall between the church and the graveyard.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we bring horror into the church. And there are some nods to that, but that ended up being an idea that maybe wasn't the main one of the book. But I think it's a really, really important one, and one I'm really
maybe
glad
the publisher
you lift
thought
up.
it might be marketing, thought it might be a little off-putting for the audience. Who knows? But now, you mentioned the introduction was one of the most fun part to write. As you were writing it, what else were some things where you just had a blast putting it together?
There are a lot of the chapters that are close to my heart and that I really love. I think what I get most excited about is when I can come up with an idea that seems kind of off the wall, but still makes sense. Like the chapter in praise of doubting Thomases, to me, was just all kinds of fun. That in our faith traditions, normally we associate doubt with weakness. And I think I think that's a misreading of our faith traditions, because I think there are all kinds of places where doubt is treated as a positive aspect of our religion, something that you work through and something that prods us on to ask more questions. So I started by reading Doubting Thomas in the New Testament as a character that I think really pushes Jesus to give better explanations, more clear explanations, to talk more, to explore and share more of who he is and what he's trying to do. And I think there are a couple of key places in the narratives where you can ask yourself, if Thomas wasn't asking these questions, do we get these speeches? Do we have these answers? So then got to connect that with some of the great doubters in film history, from people like Victor Frankenstein or the Dr. Moreau or people like that. And I thought those were really, really interesting and fun connections.
Yeah, definitely. What are some of the key takeaways that you hope readers will, they may forget some of the films or what have you.
Sure.
What are some of the key elements that you hope live beyond their reading of the book?
Oh, so I would hope that viewers, whether they're fans of horror or not, can come away feeling like there is more to horror maybe than meets the eye, and have some ideas of how to enter into that if they're watching a particular film or talking about one. And then I also hope people will come away with the idea that religion, for me, this is one of the things that I tried to convey, but I also try not to force ideas on people. But for me, religion is at its best when it's asking questions and treating answers as possible, and one of a multiplicity of answers that might even be contradictory or paradoxical, but that somehow we as believers, as inheritants of this long tradition, can hold together all at the same time. Horror and religion are both at their best when they're complicated.
Yeah, unfortunately, we tend not to like the complicated. We like the easy and the black and white, but I appreciate the kinds of questions that are raised. I think I've said this before privately in email. I'll say it publicly on video. I'm getting a little longer in the tooth, and I've tried to make my own impact in this area, but I really see you as one of the younger scholars that is really taking that baton and producing material that are helping people connect dots and ask questions. So I really appreciate your work so much.
Thank you so much, John. That really means a lot to me, man.
Well, I'm gonna put in the program notes a link to the book and a description and so on, but this isn't the only project you're working on. What else have you got in the works?
Well, so a couple of projects that you know very well. We're almost ready to drag an edited volume over the finish line that's called Horror, Comics, and Religion, right? Do I have the title right?
I think so, yeah.
I think so. Yeah, some combination of that. With Claremont Press. My understanding is that it's going to be available through open access once it's published, so that it will also be available as a print version that people can read, but then it will be available freely online in PDF form, so that hopefully that scholarship will get out, because there's some fantastic scholarship in the book, and I'm excited to start sharing that. And then for, I don't know how long it's been that you and I have been working on this. I feel like the initial proposal was accepted almost 3 years ago for the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Monsters.
I hope not. Boy, oh boy.
I think our initial timeline was that maybe it was January 20 or something like that, like right before the pandemic. And then we gave people like a year to a year and a half to work on the initial drafts, and we've got most of those in, although we're still kind of wrangling a few stray authors together. But that it's a massive project, as you know, about 30 chapters, so it'll be close to 600 pages once it's all said and done. And another one that, while the price tag is hefty for the hardback, Oxford Scholarship makes their stuff available in article format through lots of universities and colleges and seminaries and places have access to those Oxford online resources, to where hopefully those chapters will get some traction. And I think it's such a neat blend. There's often been a divide in biblical scholarship of people who want to talk about monsters, but they only want to talk about it in terms of traditional historical critical comparative studies with, let's talk about Leviathan with Tiamat and Lotan from the Ugaritic texts and things like that. And then people who really want to do, kind of more like what I do, the postmodern readings where we're talking about it in conjunction with horror movies. This volume really brings those two perspectives together, and you find everybody in between. So I'm hoping it can not only be interesting to readers, but also kind of serve a bridge in the field itself for that what would you say, traditional postmodern divide that is really strong in biblical studies.
Plus, it's got that modern section, or I don't know, what would we call it? Contemporary.
Yeah. And that's where we go furthest into the what would you say, the cultural readings, the reception criticism, where we talk about, creation stories in the Bible in conjunction with Frankenstein and that movie Splice, things like that, where we talk about all kinds of ways that these biblical themes continue to endure in horror stories.
Yeah.
And I do have a book that I'm finishing up as an author. It's called Concerning Dust and Ashes, Divine Terror in the Hebrew Bible. So looking at encounters with the divine in the Bible, kind of using the framework of the sublime, but arguing that the sublime is something that you can only hold on to for a second. You go there, but you can't live there. Kind of comparing it to Todorov's Fantastic. You have to fall down on one side or the other. You either go into wonder, which is how great thou art, God, or you go into terror, which represented in places like Job. We see it in many other places as well. And I'm arguing that there's maybe a little more terror than where we frequently admit. But then my further move that I'm trying to do, and we'll see if this all comes together, is the idea that horror is a spur for learning and growth, that confrontation with the divine serves as a way to open up people's minds. And my main test case for that is Job, when he has been beaten up metaphorically by God, and he finally says, I have spoken of things that I knew not, things that were beyond my understanding. And I don't think he really says, I repent concerning dust and ashes. I think it's more like, I have changed my mind concerning dust and ashes, meaning I'm rethinking what humanity means.
Yeah, but that all sounds fascinating. I can't wait. I understand the projects we're working on together, but that book that you're authoring there, all I can do is encourage you to keep on keeping on.
Thank you. I've got the first draft of it done, and I've got Oxford's hoping to see revisions of it in the next couple of months. So I've got my work cut out for me. I've got all these ideas swirling around, and just at the point of can we make them come together? I think I can. My confidence level is like 80 to 85%.
Good. Fantastic. Wow. Well, I appreciate, again, this new book is Lurking Under the Surface, Horror, Religion, and the Questions That Haunt Us. And I want to encourage everybody watching to either go to your local bookstore and get it, or online, whatever, and pick up a copy. It's a great read.
Oh, thanks so much, John.
Brandon, thank you so much for coming here and having
Absolutely.
a conversation at Theo Fantastique.
Always love having a conversation with you, John. Thank you much.
Sure.